Hello, you're watching Roundtable. Russia's war in Ukraine has raised fears in Bosnia and Kosovo that their vulnerable states could be attacked next. And they've re-emphasized their desire to join the existing 30 member countries in NATO. Yet that membership remains an obstacle. Kosovo isn't recognized by 4 NATO members: Greece, Romania, Slovakia, and Spain, while Bosnia's internal political situation is extremely divided. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Apart from Serbia, which, like Russia, views NATO as the enemy, Bosnia and Kosovo are the only 2 Balkan states outside of NATO. And Russia's war in Ukraine has brought back many flashbacks for Bosnia and Kosovo, both of which suffered mass killings and genocide committed by Serb forces in the 1990s. Leaders from both Bosnia and Kosovo have said that joining NATO would help preserve regional security.
We want to be full member of NATO because we believe that NATO is a great defense and security umbrella of Europe as continent and of EU as main project of peace and prosperity since the Second World War.
Russia has always opposed further NATO expansion in the Balkans. Last year, the Russian embassy in Bosnia's capital, Sarajevo, warned that if Bosnia took steps towards joining NATO, our country will have to react to this hostile act. Could Russia's war in Ukraine spill over into the Balkans? Time now for us to take a look at this in much more detail. We go to Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia, and Hamza Kacic waits for us there. He's from the Political Science Unit at the University of Sarajevo. To Pristina, Kosovo, and Besa Kaboshi Ramai, security expert and a member of the presidency of the Democratic Party of Kosovo. We welcome you. And in London, Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Let me come to the capital of Kosovo and the capital of Bosnia first of all. And I'll start with you, Hamza, if I may, and say, do you feel more exposed as a country, do you think, now than before?
We feel the pressure that Ukraine faces, and we feel a deep sense of solidarity with Ukraine because Bosnia went through a war of aggression exactly 30 years ago. So we feel that the Ukrainian resistance is also just not simply the resistance of the Ukrainian people, but also the defense of Europe is being now waged in Ukraine. So we do feel the pressure that we have seen, much more enhanced since the late February when the invasion began.
And why is it that you feel perhaps you are more exposed than you were before? Is it just the fact that we're seeing what Russia is capable of, or have the dynamics changed in your country?
Well, the invasion of Ukraine has shown that 2 of Bosnia's key politicians, the Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik and Bosnian Croat leader Dragan Čović, have both been now outed as Bosnia's Russian pro-Russian actors, and both of them have refused to condemn the invasion, and both have blocked efforts in Bosnia's state parliament to impose sanctions on Russia. So Bosnia is facing internal pressure and external pressure as a result of these 2 pro-Russian actors being in a firm alliance.
Okay, where do you stand in Kosovo, Besa?
Well, we have this sense of true compassion with people of Ukraine. It's not been such a long time ago that Kosovo went through a very serious aggression itself, and the people here have very fresh memories of what happened. So while we are aware of the dangers that lie within a conflict that's so close to this area, we don't feel that this is a direct threat for Kosovo per se. We feel that the presence of NATO here via the Kosovo Security Force enables us to have less fears as far as aggression towards Kosovo. Plus, the political context of the war between, Russia and Ukraine is very, very different from the complexities of this region. That's not to say that this region is still finished business.
I will come back
we
to you.
feel
Sorry,
that
I thought
this
you'd
is an
finished for a moment,
opportunity
Besa. I will come back to you in a little while and ask you what you think the benefits of being in NATO would be. But I want to play this in, or rather, I want to read this out from the Russian ambassador. This is Igor Kalabuhov. If Bosnia and Herzegovina decides to be a member of any alliance, that's an internal matter. Our response is a different matter. Ukraine's example shows what we expect. Should there be any threat, we will respond. What would you expect that to mean, Jamie, do you think?
Well, I think it's a bluff and bluster, David, frankly, because, of course, every time a country joins NATO, we hear this from the Russians, for example, threatening to put nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad up north if Finland and Sweden decide to cross the Rubicon and join NATO over the next couple of weeks. I think in the Balkans, where they know, for example, and this was said just a moment ago by one of your guests in the case of Bosnia, that political opinion is divided, they probably hope that these sort of intimidation tactics would have some sort of success. But at the same time, what we've seen in the Balkans over the last couple of years is NATO has gone ahead with enlargement. The most recent members have come from the Balkans. North Macedonia, the most recent one, Montenegro a few years ago, Croatia, Albania, Slovenia. So the bulk of these countries are now in NATO, and nobody could argue that their security has been threatened by Russia in any way since they joined. So I think particularly in the Ukraine context at the moment, we're going to hear a lot of this, but I think the allies will keep a cool head. And I certainly don't think that this is going to deter countries that want to join the alliance from progressing along that path.
Given your previous job title, Emerging Security Challenges, is this one of those, making sure that Russian influence, let's say in Serbia, doesn't come to dominate the politics to such an extent that what's happened in Ukraine could possibly happen in that region?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, David. Obviously, we're not dealing with a situation like we are vis-a-vis Poland and the Baltic states, where Russia has large numbers of troops in the vicinity and could, I don't think this would make sense, but could conceivably launch some kind of military attack. Russia doesn't have forces stationed in the Balkans, although it does send occasionally minor contingents, for example, to Serbia to participate in military exercises. So you're absolutely right. We're looking at a different type of problem, which comes more from interference in elections. We've seen that, for example, in Montenegro, where there was a Russian-Serbian-inspired attempt at a coup d'etat, and certain people are now being prosecuted for that in Montenegro on the eve of its NATO membership. Russian interference in the elections of North Macedonia, and of course, the usual sort of hybrid type of campaigns to try to sow dissent, polarize public opinion. And of course, NATO's onto that, together with the European Union, in terms of building the resilience of these countries against those kind of tactics. I would also say that, and I agree with, again, your guest from Kosovo, that the Balkans is unfinished business. And I think the NATO member states, the EU, have woken up a little bit recently to the fact that they need to improve their influence there. It's notable, for example, that tomorrow in Berlin, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is bringing together the Serbian leader and the Kosovo leader to try to get talks going again on the status of Kosovo. So if I can use the phrase, at least in terms of the EU and NATO, the empire is now trying to fight back.
Let's talk about the geopolitical implications of what appears to be Serbia's closeness to the Kremlin. Is that something that concerns you? You first, Hamza, then you, Besa, and Pristina.
Well, we have seen that both Serbia's President Vučić and Bosnia's leader Milorad Dodik have been building close relations with Kremlin. And so what we have seen, unlike 10 years ago, when there was no open opposition to Bosnia's NATO accession, what we see today are increasingly vocal statements by Russian officials opposing Bosnia's NATO's accession. So this is both A, interference in Bosnia's internal affairs, and B, an assertive opposition to NATO expansion that we haven't seen 10 years ago.
Why would you think Serbia wants to increase the conditions it has with its relationship with Moscow? Why does it want to get closer?
I think it's building both an energy, economic, and security cooperation with Russia as a way of balancing its relations with the West. And many analysts in the region agree that basically what the Serbian president is doing is trying to increase his leverage vis-a-vis the West by hedging his bets.
Besa, I'm going to come to you in a second, but that is after we hear from your country's president.
It has never been more important than now. It's absolutely an imperative, especially when it comes to NATO membership right now. So I do call an appeal on members of NATO to now see membership, especially from a security lens, especially from a security perspective, and leave some of the political issues that they usually keep in mind aside for a moment and think how what is going on in Ukraine can have a spillover effect very quickly on the Western Balkans and other parts of Europe. For that reason, to allow both Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Ukraine, obviously, right now, to join NATO is an absolute imperative.
So there she's saying to NATO, and in fact to the European Union as well, accelerate everything, almost as if she feared the country was in danger.
Well, it's not a secret. It's not a secret that Serbia has always functioned historically like a satellite of Russia. And fortunately, I think for the Serbian people in this case, but also for the Kosovo-Serbia relations, in this situation where, we see an outright aggression of Russia through the war in Ukraine, Serbia aligned itself in the wrong side of history, in our opinion. And it's very obvious, I think, to all the Western countries, especially the EU and NATO, their positioning has been wrong. So now it's more obvious than ever how conflicted Serbia is between, East and West, and its links to Russia are extremely obvious. Everybody else has joined the sanctions. They haven't, and it took them quite a few days to position themselves, which means they were having internal doubts. The internal elections could play a role, but historically speaking, they've been playing this game between East and West. And even if you look at the security cooperation, they have been using and buying, Russian-made weapons at the same time that they were doing joint exercises with NATO. So we feel that while this might not be a direct threat as far as, the possibility of a conventional warfare or anything of that sort, this is an opportunity to see where Serbia stands versus where Kosovo stands, and to make the necessary progress to close up shop, so to say, on all affairs Western Balkans, so this region is stabilized once and for all. And one way to do that is to have some steady progress towards the EU and especially towards NATO membership. This does not mean that it's a realistic expectation for Kosovo to want to do that overnight. But we think that it is realistic to expect a tailored relationship with NATO, just like one was designed with the EU, despite the 5 non-recognizers there.
Okay,
so this is a moment to conclude business in Western Europe in Western Balkans once and for all.
So perhaps not an overt show of force against either Bosnia or Kosovo, but more insidious influence. Jamie, let me come to you. What are we talking about? 30 at the moment. Add in Bosnia, add in Kosovo, add in Finland, Sweden, 34. How does this differ from the Finland-Sweden dynamic?
Well, clearly, in the case of Finland and Sweden, it's mainly to do with military threats, David. As I mentioned earlier, the perception since Putin invaded Ukraine that Russia could, in fact, pose a direct military threat. And indeed, as you know, over the last couple of years, and in fact, even over the last few days, we've had Russian aircraft violating Swedish and Finnish airspace, Russian submarines in Swedish territorial waters. Their GPS systems have been interfered with. So they do perceive perceive a direct sort of military threat from Russia, and that's now driving them away from non-alignment into the arms of NATO. As I've said before, in the Balkans, I think it's rather different. It's a sense of NATO and EU membership, not just providing economic prosperity and investment and giving them a role, a seat at the table, but it's a promoter of internal stability and internal unity, particularly where you have countries which in the past have been riven by ethnic dissensions, and they see, as I say, Russia, as was said earlier, mainly in terms of dependency on for energy, for materials, for investments, and so on. I think that clearly what the EU needs to do, because enlargement to the Western Balkans is a long way off in terms of the economy gap, is to try to come up with some sort of novel interim solutions that could persuade these countries that it's worthwhile reforming, because the Brussels door is open. You know, things like visa liberalisation, more economic aid, more labour mobility, more access to the single market, a kind of pre-accession or even associate membership, these kind of interim things that the EU hasn't really considered in the past, but which I think now are being more suitable for the condition that the Western Balkans are in.
Hamza, do you think that would be an indication of the fact that it might not be too long until Bosnia, for example, got it what it wanted in the long run?
I think when we compare NATO and EU enlargement in the region, NATO should be given priority. And I think this is an excellent opportunity for NATO to fast track both Bosnia's but also Kosovo's full membership. And we know that the EU accession is a long way off. So in the meanwhile, security is the primary concern of many citizens of both Bosnia and Kosovo. So NATO should move forward towards fast tracking these countries' membership. And I think also President Biden is in a unique position to consolidate his legacy by finishing the job in the Balkans. We all recall his interest and support for Bosnia and Kosovo 30 years ago, but now is the chance for him to consolidate his foreign policy legacy by integrating these two countries into the Atlantic Alliance.
You talk about fast-tracking. I've got this from Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO. The Kremlin's trying to make NATO and the European Union provide less support to our partners, so our collective answer must be more support to countries like Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina to help them succeed with their democratic reforms and pursue the path that they have freely chosen. Is that Besa, reason for optimism?
I think that is necessary but not sufficient, because we have to see these words being translated into substantial decisions by NATO to enlarge, to include these two countries. And let me remind you that in Southeast Europe, only Bosnia and Kosovo have yet to join NATO. Serbia has declared itself independent, or rather neutral, and that neutrality should be respected. But Serbia's neutrality should in no way influence the process of Bosnia's and Kosovo's accession to NATO.
Hamza, that wasn't intended to go to you. That was for Besa. But listen, thank you very much indeed for your response. I saw you look a little bit surprised, Besa, but your opportunity now to respond to what I said.
Sure, his statement leaves room to believe that there is a new opportunity, an open window to do something that Kosovo has wanted to do for a long time, which is tailor something to Kosovo, considering there are the 4 non-recognizers, and that is a harder problem to solve right away. You know, the convincing 4 countries that not out of direct hostility towards Kosovo, but because of internal issues, have a stance of non-recognition. At the same time, Kosovo is undergoing a dialogue with Serbia. And so we understand that NATO accepts members who at one point where the standards are met, but also have no problems with neighboring countries. So we have these 2 challenges as a country. Yet, like I said before, we see statements like that as an opportunity to tailor something to Kosovo in order to not necessarily find the ideal solution, but the next best solution to ensure progress between Kosovo and NATO relationship. In our case, I think a tailored program would work. We understand fully that the PFP program was created, generally speaking, for countries who needed to have these reforms, either within their institution, the wide spectrum of their institutions, but especially the military. In our case, we had the luxury of creating everything from scratch. So we created everything already based on these standards. And the Kosovo Security Force already works very closely with the NATO liaison advisory team to meet these standards. But, we might have technical issues that we might have to meet here and there, and that's not the big challenge. I think our biggest challenge, like I said, are the non-recognizers and the dialogue with Serbia. Nonetheless, these statements leave room for maneuver because they show an opportunity in light of the recent security context. They show that there is an opportunity to tailor a relationship with Kosovo, which would be the way forward. Like I said, I want to reiterate, it's unrealistic to think that you can become a NATO member overnight, but it is quite realistic to believe that in the current context we can do something along the lines of the SAA, which was done with the EU.
Okay,
and it worked.
Jamie, not overnight, but how long if it's going to happen? And what are the dangers of NATO getting too big?
Well, I don't think, David, that sort of getting bigger by itself means that you get weaker, if you mean by that, too many disputes and absence of consensus. I mean, I remember that we had far more disputes in NATO when I was there as a young diplomat with simply 16 members than we had later on with 30 members. So as long as you make sure that the new members are up to speed, share the values, as was said, are ready for membership, and are willing to go along with the solidarity calls, there's no sort of finite number where if you sort of add one more, suddenly like a sandcastle, the whole thing collapses. But I would say that obviously both NATO and the EU, as they get larger, are going to want to make sure that those exacting standards are met, and that means that if the process is going to take a long time, as I've said earlier, we can't simply say to the countries in the Western Balkans, look guys, we'll be ready when you're ready, putting all of the onus on them to reform. Frankly, they can't do it without our help, both political and economic. And I think for a while there was a sense, David, about the Western Balkans that, the only place that they could go towards was Brussels. And therefore we had all of the influence we needed. But I think in the wake of the greater Russian influence, we didn't mention China, which also now is a major economic and military player and technology player in Serbia and elsewhere in the region. For example, Montenegro has got itself into a massive amount of debt for contracting with a Chinese company to build a motorway in Montenegro. Turkey is an influential player, so is Saudi Arabia in terms of religious foundations. So I think NATO and the EU have woken up to the fact that this is a competitive field and we need to compete much more. And I think the fact that, the US now has got a special envoy for the region, the Germans have recently named a special envoy. I mentioned Olaf Scholz getting the parties together in Berlin, more EU action in trying to mediate between Kosovo and Serbia, particularly now that the elections are over in Serbia. I think it shows that, the EU realizes that if we want this region to come towards Brussels rather than Moscow and or Beijing, we're going to have to fight for it, and we're going to have to show a lot more energy and sense of purpose than maybe was the case over the last 10 years.
Hamza, when I was doing a program about Finland and Sweden just a few days ago, possibly joining NATO, I asked the question, was this likely to provoke the bear? Were we poking the Russian bear and enraging Moscow, the Kremlin, Putin, whatever? Is there any danger that all the talk from Sarajevo, basically all the talk from Pristina, is actually going to make Russia more aggressive rather than less? You Hamza, first?
Well, I see no way how Bosnia's or NATO's accession threatens Russia. And I think that argument simply doesn't stand. So I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay. Besa, what do you say?
It won't make such a big difference. We understand that the Russian government could take it as an excuse, make it up as an excuse, frame it as an excuse. But it definitely is not an excuse. It's not been a secret that Kosovo has always wanted to be part of EU and NATO, and we don't even have any doubts on those 2 points, as opposed to our surrounding countries. Serbia, we know exactly where she stands, and even Bosnia has some internal dissent when it comes to such topics, but in Kosovo, that's not the case. So, no.
An excuse to do what, though?
An excuse to further build an aggressive agenda. Like I said before, it may not be conventional warfare in this region, but it's not been strange. It's been quite common to notice subversive actions that have actually fueled internal unrest in several countries. I think it was previously mentioned by one of the speakers, the problems that Russia has fueled within Montenegro. I think it was Mr. Shea that mentioned it, and it's not been uncommon to see, different funding, economic influence, and so forth and so on, being used in this region to push a Russian agenda of influence.
Extraordinary. Listen, thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we've reached the end of our road. If you guys haven't reached the end of yours when it comes to NATO accession, listen, thank you very much indeed. Time is our worst enemy. Hamza, Besat, Jamie, thank you for coming on this edition of Roundtable. Thank you wherever you happen to be watching, and we hope to have your company next time. Until then, from me, David Foster, and the team, goodbye.